Welcome to this press conference with Renaud Camus. My name is Tore Rasmussen, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers. We will have Renaud Camus with us from France, and Associate Professor Renaud Camus in location here in Oslo. We will start by showing a 30-minute pre-recorded interview, and then Mr. Øykrem and Renaud will take the stage and conduct a 90-minute live interview with Camus. So please play the pre-recorded video. Okay, so welcome. I'm very happy to have you here, Mr. Renaud Camus and Øykrem. We are very happy to be able to facilitate this short interview regarding that we are publishing your book. You will not replace us into Norwegian. The Norwegians have this Dere, skal ikke, erstatte. And regard to this translation, we wanted to do a quick interview with Mr. Camus, and since Associate Professor Legatum has written the foreword for the book, we are happy to have him conducting the interview. So, without any further ado, please, Mr. Legatum.
Thank you.
Thank you. As I understand, the interview will use about space 20 minutes to 25 minutes, and we have a list of questions, Mr. Camus. And first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to the interview. I have written the foreword, and it's a very interesting book, which I hope will reach a large audience in Norway as well. So, if we could just proceed with the questions, Mr. Camus.
Yes, indeed.
The expression, the great replacement, is sometimes discussed in Norway, and you are often seen as the person who invented or came up with the term. Could you say a little bit about what you mean by the term, and how did you come by it?
It's very simple. I meant the change of people, which of course necessarily imply a change of civilization. In the space of 1 or 2 generations, there is not a complete but a very large change of people in one country, and in fact in several countries in Europe.
Do you assume that this is a general phenomenon with the West, or does it focus primarily on France?
Oh, it doesn't especially focus on France, although it is of course very, very strong in France, but I don't think it's more important than, say, Great Britain, for instance. And it's also very high in Germany, in Sweden, maybe in Norway. It's enormous in Belgium or in the Low Countries. No, it's all of Western Europe.
And you write in your book that in terms of the status of the concept, you describe it as a fact, as something which is factually taking place or has taken place already. It is not a theory or a concept, you say. Could you say a little bit about the status of your claim?
Well, I heard a name recently which is absolutely perfect for Paul Masson. It's a less practiced word of colonym, which means a name for a period, like La Belle Époque, the beautiful time, or all sorts of names in history. And I think the Grand Remplacement is a name for a period after its most important phenomenon, which is, in my opinion, by far the change of people and of civilization which it implies.
So you then think that this phenomenon is a dominant phenomenon which shapes our times. It is what should be the headline when describing our times.
Yes, I think it is by far the most important phenomenon of the present time. It is also, in my opinion, the crime against humanity of the 21st century, because it's a horrible thing.
Could you say a little bit about the causes behind it? Why is this taking place? I mean, this is a huge question, a complex question.
Yes, it is a huge question. The Colonization is not a theory, it is a name for a phenomenon and for a period of time. But I have a theory which is called global replacism. I think replacement is the main phenomenon of post-industrial and postmodern times, everything being replaced by something else. And the grand remplacement, as enormous as it is only a small part of global replacism, which is that phenomenon of changing things for something else in all fields of life, in materials, in intellectual work. Everything is replaced by something simpler, cheaper, industrial. It could be called industrialization. It can be called standardization, normalization, or artificialization, which is another name for global replacism. For instance, the big replacement of agricultural land by cement, construction, industrialization, even the industrialization of agriculture, for instance, which is the last but one human activity which is becoming an industry, implies a great replacement of countryside. Maybe you don't have that in Norway, because Norway is very big and not very densely populated, but in France there is less and less countryside, for instance. It all become suburbs, and suburbs very soon is turning into what we call in France bidonvilles, that is slums.
So would you then say that this is like a culmination of processes which we often refer to as modernity? This is like the last phase of modernity?
Yes, I could very well agree with that. It is all part of the story of industrial revolution as it starts in the mid of the 18th century. There has been several industrial revolutions, first, second, third, fourth. We probably are the fifth industrial revolution, which more or less implies dehumanization of man.
So your way of thinking here relates to many of the classics within social theory. I mean, Marx, de Tocqueville, thinkers of modernity, etc. So you actually bring these theories and ideas to bear on the demographic exchange taking place in our time.
Very much so, because I think man, which was the producer, has become the consumer. Of course, Frederick Taylor and Henry Ford are very important to the story I tell of great replacement and of global replacism. But the most important modern phenomenon is that man being already producer and consumer is becoming the product. He is treated as a product. As far as he is a consumer, what global replacism produces is man as a consumer. And of course, what he consumes is Earth, la Terre, the planet, which is being consummated very fast.
Exactly. So you have sometimes perhaps been met with accusations that what you say is a conspiracy theory. Is there any conspiracy taking place, and to what extent do you conceive that the processes you describe are the result of a conspiracy?
Well, the expression conspiracy theory is totally absurd in its two elements. It's not a theory, at least grand remplacement is not a theory. Global replacement is a theory, but it's certainly not a conspiracy theory. What I call the theory of conspiracy theory is, of course, the most effective and intelligent invention of the replacist to eliminate all attempt of explanation of what is going on and the denunciation of the crime. The word conspiracy is, of course, much too small for what is going on. It is, as everything in history, political and economical, and very much a mechanical, a purely industrial phenomenon, which not necessarily implies human will or volunteer. It is very much a more purely industrial. So I could admit that no one wants it. A lot of people profit of it, but I certainly never denounce anybody as wanting it, and I certainly do not think that a lot of people, that 20 or 30 people once congregated in a room and decided that they were going to proceed to the great replacement of population in France or Belgium or Norway or wherever. That is not at all the story I'm trying to reconstitute. But I do think, of course, that a lot of people are taking advantage and giving profit from the great replacement and what I call Davocracy, which is the government of the planet by Davos, by financial bank, and a purely economical way of thinking what presence on earth is. Democracy is great replacing democracy, I think.
Could we then move on a little bit to what you think the elites in Western societies, what is their role in these processes? Do they help the process as along? What is the role of elites?
Well, I have some trouble with this word because the elites in the plural form are the contrary of elite in the singular form. There was an elite, but there is no elite anymore. The elite is not an intellectual elite. It's just, I don't use the word elite because I have a sort of remnants of sympathy for the word. I think we would be much better if elite was existing, but there is no elite anymore. Culturally, there is absolutely no elite. What I call the small replacement, the petit remplacement, is precisely the elimination of elite. All tyranny, when they install themselves, the first thing they do is eliminating the real elite, like at Katyn, when the Soviets invaded Poland, they killed all the Polish elite. Same thing in Cambodia, under Pol Pot, they eliminated completely the elite. And there is no elite in France, which I think is the reason why the people is left totally without protection against purely economical and now financial, and now not even financial, but numerical, cybernetic forces, which are not necessarily people and which I would certainly not call an elite.
I just use the term trying to describe those who have their hands on the wheels of power in Western societies. If we use that definition, how would we say that these groups contribute or relate to the process that you're going on? You already answered it in terms that you said that they are trying to make a profit of what is happening.
Yes, of course. The profit is that they want more and more consumers for the consummation of earth and for their own profit. So they want people to be more and more numerous. And I think that European people were extremely wise in their demographic attitude, which is a slow and very limited but perfect, in my mind, decrease of population, which is unbearable, of course, to democracy, because they want more and more consumers, so they replace people with a very reasonable demographic attitude by people who are producing more and more made as product, and those products being consumer, they are product because they are consumers, and of course the democracy wants more and more of those.
Maybe we should move on a little bit to another thing which is interesting, is that the Encyclopedia Britannica, which you perhaps know,
yes,
which is internationally renowned encyclopedia, lists that the Great Replacement is a conspiracy theory. And this has been used to prevent the publishing company here in Norway against renting an arena for public discourse. This perhaps relates to ideologies which are hegemonic in the West, which exclude certain ideas and lines of thought. Could you say a little bit about that, please?
It's what I said before. I think the invention of the term conspiracy theory, of course there are a lot of conspiracy theories which are totally absurd and well known to be absurd and idiotic, so they use the term if they want to deconsider it and eliminate all question about what they are doing. Every little journalist in France, every time he's meeting or she is meeting an opinion which she doesn't approve of, calls it a conspiracy theory. In Le Grand Remplacement, in global replacism, there is not a word about the slightest conspiracy, which would be, of course, absurd. A conspiracy is something wanted by a very small number of people to gain power, and it's not at all my point. There is not a word of conspiracy in any of the books I publish, be it The Great Replacement, which is a constant of the real phenomenon, or in the book called The Negotiation, which is my theory. At least it is a theory, that, but it's not a conspiracy theory. If you call it a conspiracy theory, all political theory is a conspiracy. You can say of Marx that it is a conspiracy theory. You can say of Tocqueville that it is a conspiracy theory. Forgive me for those glorious examples to which I do not assimilate myself, but of any political opinion or economical theory, if you don't approve of it, you can now call it a conspiracy theory, and that allows you to eradicate it from everywhere, being the Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia or any paper in Western Europe, because it's called a conspiracy theory. The invention of the theory of conspiracy theory is the most efficacious way to eradicate the thing which must not be mentioned. And the thing which must not be mentioned is global racism and the Great Replacement, which is the crime against humanity of the 21st century, which is also what I call the present form of negationism. But the big difference between the two negationisms, the old negationism about the Shoah and about gas chamber, was put forward by a few dozens of people in caves, as the second negationism, which is the negationism of genocide by substitution, in the world of the French communist and black poet Aimé Césaire. The negation of that is everywhere in the palaces of government, in the building of the press, in the palace of justice. It's a triumph of negationism. But it is beginning to be abandoned. I was speaking currently of negationists, of the bloc négationiste génocidaire, but that bloc is more and more genocidarian, but less and less negationism, for two reasons. For one thing, they can't be negationists anymore because the change of people is so obvious, so easy for anyone to see in every street of Western Europe. But it is becoming impossible to say that it doesn't exist. And the other reason is that the people who are replacing this are so pleased with the concept of great replacement that they are very triumphant about it. And they do say, yes, we are the great replacement, we are your replacement. So as far as those people are accepting to admit that they are replacing us, which they are more and more, there can't be any more negationism. So the bloc negationist genocidarian is more and more genocidarian and less negationist.
Thank you. I think the concept and the central idea is very clear now, at least for me, and I hope also for the readers of the book. Could we move a little bit on to a different topic, which relates to you as a writer and what responsibility you have or do not have? And for example, I have noticed that you have been blamed for acts that other people have committed. For example, there was a mass murderer in New Zealand where a politician claimed that you had some responsibility as he was claimed to have read your book. Could you say a little bit about this?
Yes, it's something people do not want that the great replacement be named, so they are ready to invent absolutely anything to make me responsible for horrible crimes, as the center of my political and moral reflection is a concept which is a little bit maybe difficult to explain in English to Norwegians, is the concept of innocence. I think of non-nonsense. Nonsense being every harm done to people, to property, and to the earth, to nature, to water, to air. And this is a central concept of my theory. I even funded a political party, which is probably the smallest political party ever, which is Parti de l'Innocence, that is of non-nonsense, non doing any harm to anybody and to the earth itself. And so, of course, every time somebody is committing a crime, like that horrible crime in Christchurch, is proving by the very fact that I am of no influence whatever on him, because he's doing exactly the contrary of what I recommend what I recommend is no source, and if I am against great replacement and against global replacism, it's precisely because great replacement is producing an enormous amount of no source, of harm in Western societies. For instance, on rape, on crimes of every sort, of mistreatment to the cities, the towns, the districts, the buildings themselves, is an enormous amount of what I call no source. And it is because I think no source should be fighting against, that I am against great replacement, because it is bringing nuisance and crime and harm to people and to the earth. But as for the crime you mentioned in Christchurch, it has been proven twice in court that the man who has done that crime, which is attributed to my influence because he has written a text called The Great Replacement, but he makes absolutely no allusion to me. The book, The Great Replacement, was not translated into English at the time. He obviously doesn't know me at all. He never mentioned me, and his brochure is defending all sorts of opinions which has absolutely nothing whatever to do with me. And this has been established twice in court in New Zealand, or at least all judgment, when he was there was very serious and long inquest on the influence upon him, and they never found the slightest trace of my influence upon him. It seems he doesn't even know my name, and has certainly never read me. And it has been also established in France in a process against a woman minister who had said that he was wearing my book, The Great Replacement, on him when he committed his atrocious murders. And of course, he was not wearing my book, but he was wearing his brochure, The Great Replacement, which has absolutely nothing with my book and with my opinion. It so happens that The Great Replacement, the expression, the syntagm, is now everywhere in the world. It's a very common expression. He has been using it, but without any reference to me whatever.
And it is quite obvious that a writer of an intellectual work cannot be held responsible for what someone else might do, which is contrary to the intent and to the content of the message which the writer has delivered. I mean, it's just absurd.
Needless to say that this Innocence Party, which has mentioned, whose main production is communique, statement, has always condemned with the most extreme rigor all attentat, all attack, things against mosques, against Muslim centuries, Jewish centuries, everything of that sort has always been condemned by us without the slightest ambiguity. Again, if we are against great replacement, it is because it is bringing that kind of horror into Western civilization and Western societies.
Thank you. Is there something which you would like to add in the end here in connection with the publication of your book in Norwegian? Because we are approaching the time limit, so we have a minute or two.
I am delighted to be translated into Norwegian because I adore Norway. I think might be the most beautiful country on earth, and I say it very sincerely. I'm a great admirer of Norwegian landscapes and Norwegian everything, in fact.
Thank you, and I hope that your book finds a big readership in Norway and is discussed in the media and elsewhere. and hopefully that your ideas can be found to be stimulating for many people. Thank you, Mr. Camus, for this conversation.
Thank you very much for your question. I was very happy to have this exchange with him, and do forgive my somewhat broken English.
We are both speakers of different languages than English, but we manage to communicate in English. That's the thing. Thank you, Mr. Camus.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Camus. This is Legatum. I hope that you're able to hear me, although you cannot see me.
Yes, I can hear you. Good evening to you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here this evening. I'm sitting here with different journalists and other members of the audience, and with Mr. Björn Christian Renaud from the publishers, and we have some questions which we hope that you can answer.
Very good.
Thank you. So I will start with a few questions, and then we will open to the audience for other questions if they have some. I don't know if you are aware, but there has been considerable attention about the publication of your book in Norway, and a lot of things has been written in the press, and I hope that you can address some of them. For example, there is a professor called Frank Auban who teaches at the University College in Østfold, which is a region in Norway, and he has claimed in a newspaper called Transit that the research on far-right extremism considers the Great Replacement to be an extreme right conspiracy theory. So he claims that your statements are contradicted by scientific research on the status of your theory. Could you say a few words about that, please?
Yes, well, my most recent book is called La Dépossession, or Dispossession, which is about the dispossession of man all over the world. And one of the things which is one of the principal elements of the dispositions of man is scientific pseudo-theories, I think. My book starts with a famous statement of Nietzsche in 1882 about the death of God, and I think God has been replaced as a supreme instance of truth by science. But science has as many heretics and chapels and different sections has had any reagent before it. And one of those minor sections has become very important, which is sociology, with its two minor companies, its two minor accompaniments, which are demographics and statistics. And those are not very scientific, and I think that numbers has been the main instrument of lying. I give many examples of that. For instance, this is a very trivial and elementary example, but for instance, sociology in France has been, and I think is still saying, that there are less foreigners in France now than there were in the 30s, for instance. And in a way it is true, of course. It is, as numbers goes, it is true. There are less foreigners. Of course, all foreigners have been what we call in French naturalized. They are becoming French, so they are considered in French. Number have been really the great instrument of lying and of what I call negationism or global national negationism.
They've been lying about everything, not about the great replacements. They've been lying about school numbers. We're saying that there are schools were getting better and better, but people, school children were getting more and more knowledgeable, which is proven, which is obviously totally true. I don't know how it works in Norway, but in France, school is in a total state of collapse. It's not working anymore. The numbers have proven that crime was diminishing, but there was no relation between immigration and crime. Numbers have been proving absolutely everything, and most of the things, numbers or pseudoscience have been proven were totally false. Even that have been proven for ages, but there was no great replacement in France, for instance. And of course, you can't hold this position anymore. There are less and less people are still holding this position, because you can't deny reality forever. And what I call dispossession is precisely the dispossession of man and of his own way of looking at things, of his own confidence in his own observation by science. The science has been pseudoscience. I'm not criticizing true science or science in general, but false science, lying science, having dispossessing man of his own experience, of his own judgment, of his own faith in his own observation. They were telling him that those observations were wrong, that they were only in his aid, that it was an illusion, but it was not an illusion at all. It was the numbers which were illusions and were constantly used to promote negationism. It is an interesting fact that both negationism, the old negationism about Shoah and the modern negationism about genocide by substitution are always very precise. They are always giving numbers and all other numbers to prove their point. But their point is wrong and it's false.
Thank you. I also have another question about a statement made in the press by a Norwegian philosopher called Renaud Camus. And she claimed to a local newspaper in Oslo that you were a fascist. Do you have any comment on this?
Oh, is it worth a comment? I mean, this is the most vulgar and common thing that every people on the side of global racism are saying. They call you fascist or Nazi or neo-Nazi. Not only there's not the slightest trace of fascism in me and of all Nazis or neo-Nazis, but I think that we are the only consequent. Does that make sense in English or in Norwegian? I think we are the only consequent anti-Nazi. I think global racism is a modern totalitarianism, and that is the third totalitarianism born in the 20th century. Nazism or fascist, if you prefer, communist, of course, Soviet communist, and global racism. I'm not a fascist at all, but I think that we anti-racists are the only real anti-Nazis or anti-fascists or anti-totalitarian.
Thank you. I have a different question to you, Mr. Camus, about you may be aware that we originally planned to have this press conference in a public library in the centre of Oslo. But due to pressure groups, including elected politicians, socialist, communist politicians in Oslo, it was impossible to have the press conference there. So we had to move it to a hotel a little bit outside of the centre. Do you have a comment on this? What do you think about this?
Well, I think what I call the negationist genocidarian plot, which, as I explained in the interview you have just been watching, there are a few mistakes in the translation of my broken English, very excusable mistakes, because I was probably not very clear because of my bad English, but there are a few mistakes in the translation, the written translation. I think the negationist genocidarian plot is, by definition, the power. There are people in power, so they can, and their obsession is that the crimes against humanity of the 21st century, that is, the change of people, civilization, genocide by substitutions, in the word of the French black poet Aimé Césaire, there are people who are committing that crime are asked for main objective, but it won't be mentioned. So they will prevent, for instance, me, I am a writer without publishers in France at all. I publish my own books. I have no access whatever to mainstream television or radios or anything. You become a total pariah if you accuse that bloc, which is the most powerful bloc in the world, and you can't speak in any places, and I'm very used to that, so I was, of course, not in the least surprised by the sad news that were coming from Norway. It is a normal thing. That, the strange thing, I don't know, maybe I'm too long, the strange thing is you mentioned socialist or communist political persons. The strange thing is that those people, leftist people, should be, of course, entirely with us. But the real power, the industrial power, the financial and numerical power, the power of the machination of man, the industrialization of man, are not using right-wing forces anymore. Those seem to them useless. They much prefer the left ideas of equalization and anti-racism. Those are what the traditional right-wing financial powers are willing to use now. So people most opposed to global regressisms have for oppositions left-wing political figures which are in fact serving financial and industrial ideas contrary to what they think, unless they are conscious of what they are doing. I'm not sure of that. I'm not sure they are.
No, I would like to add for your information, Mr. Camus, that also several Norwegian newspapers of repute and circulation came out on the right side in this controversy regarding allowing the publishers to use the venue, including the Norwegian newspaper Dere, which is important for the liberal establishment of the country. So it is not correct to say that all newspapers came out on the wrong side, but considerably did. If I could move on to... Do you have a comment on that as well?
Yes, I have. Maybe there has been a slight misunderstanding. I certainly agree that some traditional liberal forces or papers or political movements are willing to admit that a different opinion be expressed, but there are most of them in France. I wouldn't presume to tell of the situation in Norway, but in France, all mainstream papers, be they of traditional right or of the left, are opposed to anti-Fascism. They are, in fact, favorable to the change of people, but some of them, maybe especially from the traditional right, may be willing to admit that there be a right of expression that's different.
I can inform you that a lot of the public debate here is also focused on the fact that Norwegian law does not allow for censure or exclusion of opinion or for any legal measures to be taken against opinions before they are expressed. If they are against the law, that can be a matter for the legal system, but it can only be done after the fact that they have been stated. You cannot prevent opinions from being expressed before they have actually been expressed. Norwegian law does not open for that.
I'm very glad to hear that, because I'm a great friend of Norway, of the Norwegian people and of Norwegian culture. Like Norway is very dear to my heart.
Good. Good. Thank you, Mr. Camus. I would also draw your attention to something, and that has been that among the comments made, attention has been drawn to the fact that you were convicted on one account of hate speech in 2014. Could you say a little bit about the context of that and on what you actually said?
Oh, yes, I have been condemned on several occasions of things to pay. I'm also been condemned to prison, but with surcease, what is this, with surcease, right? I mean, I was condemned to prison, but not sent to prison. But of course I was condemned. The accusation you are alluding to, it's a suspended, what I was given was a suspended sentence. What you are alluding to, I think, is a discourse where I try to explain, it's difficult to explain. I think that Europe is much more colonized than it has ever colonized itself, because the real element of colonization is the transfer of population. And when I say that, people object that the word colonization is not right, because there is no army, there is no military force. But for colonization, you need a military force. And what I was saying was that the military operation of colonization was what I call no-sense, not innocent with a T, no-sense, like in the word innocence, but without the first syllable. No-sense, that is delinquency, delinquence, crime, whether they are very big or very small. The fact that you are committing minor or major crimes, be they rape, stealing, or terrorism, or even very small things like making things impossible to your neighbors, so they have to leave the place where they were living. My idea was, and still is, that the army of colonization are the people who are innocent, who are delinquent. It is delinquency, the military force of colonization. And the court choose to interpret that as me saying, for instance, I said, they decided to interpret it that I was saying that all Muslims were delinquent, which of course I never said, and I never thought, it never entered my mind for a second. But I was saying that delinquents among Muslims were the army, the armored arm of colonization, was the soldiers. Well, that's exactly it. That there were the soldiers of the colonization enterprise. But I was confident for saying that all Muslims were delinquent, which I never said for a minute, and of course never thought would be totally stupid.
No, of course that's false as well. So you're all right, Mr. Camus. We have received many questions online, so maybe I can read a few of them to ask you. So yes, and I have a question here, which is: what is the path forward for the native French in France? Is it re-migration, communitarianism, or expatriation?
Well, we just spoke about colonization. I think it's very important to put forward the actual drama and the long history of colonization. Because Norway has never been colonial power itself, but maybe one can consider that it has been, well, the term would be a bit too strong, a colony itself, either of Sweden or Denmark, not a colony, but at least a political possession, which many call it, because it was personal union and not conquest exactly. But France, of course, has been a colonial power and is now a colonized country. So I think all colonization, if it ever ends, when colonization has ended, it implies that part of the colonizers, for instance, when France lost Algeria, the old worlds considered that it was perfectly normal that all French people and European people, because there were not all French, there were Italians, Spaniards, there were also Jews who had been in Algeria for centuries and even millenniums. Those people had to leave, and they did leave, and they were forced to leave with an extreme violence of which nobody ever speaks, but there has been a real massacre of people to force the others to leave, and most of them came to France at the time. And indeed, I do not for a second recommend such violence, but I think that all colonization indeed must finish by the departing of the colonizer in India. When India became independent, the English had to leave. When the Black Africa became independent, the colonizer had to leave. And I just gave the example of Algeria. So I think in France and everywhere in Europe, the colonizer will have to leave, which I call indeed remigration. But I very certainly hope that it can be conducted with more civilization and humanity that it has been the case in Algeria. In Algeria, it has been done with enormous violence, and no one in the world disapproved of it. So I don't see why the discolonization of France, for instance, would be should be disapproved by the world if it is conducted with humanity, reason, and by mutual consent. For instance, I'm not at all hostile quite to the contrary, to financial agreement, to paying for people to return to their own country. If I may give a precision about the colonization of Europe now, one of its distinctive character is that it is triangular. The strange thing is that the people who are the colonizer, who makes the colonization, are not the people who want the colonization. There are three powers. The mechanical forces who want the change of people in Europe and its colonization, or its Islamization, or its Africanization, and the people who actually make the colonization just by coming over. There are three forces, like was the case for slavery, for instance, which was also triangular.
Thank you. We have still time, so I will take a few other questions from the live chat, which we have received online, before we give the word to the audience, if that's okay with you, Mr. Camus.
Yes, certainly. Yes, thank you.
Here, one person has asked, can Zionism be an example for the people of European descent? Do you see any parallel in terms of Zionism and the struggle going on in Europe?
Oh yes, very much so. Very much so. I think, well, for one thing you have to forgive my bad English. I hope you understand me, and this is a bit complicated, of course. But I think that if Jerusalem, for instance, is not Jewish, there is no reason for Paris to be French. I think I'm very ardently Zionist myself, because I think it is golden bank of all anti-human places. If a country must belong to its people, the example of that is how Israel must belong to the Jews. I'm not sure that is very clear. I hope it is, but the expression I was looking for is gold standard. Zionism is the gold standard of all anti-racism. So, of course, to answer very clearly your question, as I hope I did, yes, there is a very strong link between Zionists and what I call anti-replacism. That is the right of a people to have its own national country.
Thank you. Here is a non-political question for you, Mr. Camus. What contemporary writers do you enjoy reading?
Contemporary writers?
Yes. So many of them. It depends what contemporaries they have to be living. I suppose French writers like Pascal Quignard, like Welbeck. I am a great admirer of Welbeck. I think there are 20 times more truth in one book of Michel Welbeck than in 100 sociological essays. I was a great admirer of French poet Yves Bonnefoy, who has died 2 or 3 years ago. Well, there are hundreds of writers, of course, which I deeply admire. Of course, not at all, not all of them being contemporary or living. And the follow-up question is, what are your favorite historical authors? Do you have one favorite in particular?
Historical what?
Authors.
Author of history?
No, I mean authors from history, which are not contemporary. Which writers, which authors do you like reading is the question.
But you mean historians?
I don't mean historians, I mean any kind of authors, writers.
our writers for the past, well, there are hundreds of them, but there are, of course, writers which are very important to the history and to the study of global racism, like Dere, of course, which has the concept of Machenschaft, which in French is machination, which is a very rich term because machination is every effort to obtain something, but it is of course the fact of man becoming a machine. I'm very impressed, for instance, by a writer which has a considerable influence of me, is Polish, Jewish, and English, because he became English sociologist called Sigmund Bauman. Sigmund Bauman is a great admiration of me because he has invented the concept of liquefaction, the becoming liquid of everything. I think the becoming liquid of everything is a condition of general interchangeability, and it's very important, of course, in global racism. Everything is becoming liquid, be it the way people dress, the way people speak, human relation, everything is losing form and is becoming interchangeable because it's liquid. So it's, of course, very important for me, like so many of them, but it's difficult to make a choice. But of course, Gunther Anders is very important for me.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a different question also from the online audience. One here says, do you really believe that the Great Replacement is a reversible process? I imagine the context for this is that in Norway it's often in public debates stated as a fact that we are now a multicultural society. So this is a fact, but do you believe that the Great Replacement is a reversible process? That is the question.
Yeah, I certainly think so. If I didn't think so, I would not be here discussing with you or reading my life, or at least my social life, by trying to fight Great Replacement and global racism. I think the most significant example in the past of the possibility of a reversal of history is the opposition in Soviet Russia. The dissidents in Russia, in Soviet Russia, they were rich, but we are. They had no money whatsoever, no means, no papers, no force at all, but they were speaking the truth. And they had against them one of the biggest power in the world, which was the Soviet Union. And who would have given a penny on the chances of the dissidents? But finally, the Soviet Union collapsed in a few weeks or a few months, just because it has a spark of truth had set fire to that empire of lying. A common point between racism, so negationist, genocidal bloc, and Soviet Union is that it is entirely constructed upon lying. There is no truth at all in whatever they are saying. And those enormous construction built upon lying can collapse very fast, as the Soviet Union gave, for example, of course, it's, as all example, it's an imperfect example because, unfortunately, the Soviet Union seemed to be more or less coming back in reality under a slightly different form, less and less different. But it did collapse for a time in a very spectacular fashion. So I think that global fascism is a crime against humanity, which is the great replacement, cannot so collapse because it is entirely built on lying because everybody is lying about it, first of all, by saying that it is not taking place, while it is the most obvious thing taking place in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Camus. I will now open for the audience to ask questions, and we will do it in the following manner. That if are any questions here, please raise your hand and you can ask the question to me in English or in Norwegian, and I will repeat the question because I have the microphone to Mr. Camus. And please only ask questions, do not make long statements because I will not be able to convey them. So, are there any questions which you would like to ask?
Jeg vil ta på norsk, så tar du engelsk.
Vær så god.
Ronny Renning fra Alternativ Media. Han snakket om, han fikk spørsmål om mulig å reversere The Great Replacement. Så nevnte han Sovjetunions kollaps som et eksempel. Det skjer på det litt annerledes det her på grunn av at da var det nasjoner som var presset inn i Sovjetunionen, og når det kollapset så ser da på en måte hver nasjon tilbake til seg selv og i risstartet. Og alle konflikter som har skjedd i de landene i ettertid har jo blitt som følge av en slags migrasjon, kan vi si, av russere eller andre frem og tilbake. Altså i Ukraina, der er jo konflikten mellom russere og ukrainere, sant? Men i Europa, hvis jeg spørsmålet sånn, i Europa så har det den type innfretting av mangfoldig demografi som gjør det utrolig mye vanskelig. Det blir veldig enkelt å si at det kan kollapse på samme måte som Sovjetunionen på grunn av den innfrettingen demografisk.
Mr. Camus, I will try to make it into a question in English which you can answer. And the question regards the parallel which you drew between reversing the Great Replacement and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the argument being made here is that the process will be very different because in Europe, when the Soviet Union collapsed, people reverted into the natural ethnic unities, like nations. How do you think something will happen in reversing the Great Replacement? Could you reflect on this?
No, yes, I can, but I don't really understand the question, because of course, if global fascism, as I hope, collapse, people will indeed reverse to their natural ethnic composition, exactly like was the case with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The indigene, I think the concept of indigenous people is very important for me. We have to be conscious that we are the indigenous people. We are the people being colonized, and we have to get rid of the colonizers, and maybe before that of the people who impose colonization, which are not the same. But of course we would return to indigenous composition of the people, like in the case of every colonized nation, which have conquered its independence after colonization, which is why I say that colonization is one of the 3 or 4 important precedents in our action.
Thank you. Could you very briefly mention also other precedents, historical precedents?
Certainly. The first one is mostly in 19th century, the fight of people, historical people, indigenous people, for their independence, like in Norway in 1814, like in Belgium in 1830, like in Greece, very important in 1824 till 1830, like in Italy in 1859, 1816, like in Hungary, like in Bohemia, that was took a little longer, but they also fight for being a country, for their independence, but for the right of people to have their own country. That is the first precedent. It's very important. The second is, of course, resistance to Nazism, which is called in French simply resistance, la résistance to the German and Nazi occupation. It is, of course, a very important precedent. The third is the decolonization, which we have just mentioned. I think we all resistant to colonization are for us models. The most obvious in my case, because he was entirely non-violent, being, of course, Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi in India. And the fourth, as already been mentioned equally, are the dissidents in Soviet Union. Those are our models and precedents, which we have to imitate and emulate and trying to be as determined and courageous as they have been.
Thank you. We still have time for a question from the audience, or two maybe, perhaps, if there are any questions. You can ask them in Norwegian or in English or Swedish even.
Svenska. Den här repatrieringen. Ja, jag vet inte om man går in på det boken, men hur kommer det gå till rent tekniskt? Vem är det som avgör vem ska tillbaka och vem ska stanna?
I will ask the question, Mr. Camus. The question is the following. How will the repatriation process actually occur? How will it be decided who stays and who leaves? Do you deal with this?
Yes, of course. Who will decide is mostly the people themselves, the colonizer themselves. For instance, in France, all people who now say, we are the replacer, we are your great replacement, those people designate themselves as needing national object to remigration, because every people has a right to expel people who deliberately assume that they are conquerors or colonizers. Same thing for people who said that they are French, but that they are not really French. You have that on French TV, for instance. Very often you see people saying that they are French, but that it's not the important thing for them. But the important thing for them is that they are Moroccan or Algerian or Tunisian or from every country or tribe in Africa. If they say that, we will take them very seriously. We will take them at their own word. People who display not being French, or not being Norwegian, or not being English or Scottish or Swedish or whatever by their own comportment. I think we would have to establish a charter of what it is to be French, Norwegian, Swedish, English, whatever, and if people don't want to conform to that charter, they would have to take a charter to their own country, but they can be helped. In my program, I do propose that, for instance, if they are, of course it would be much more difficult for people who have citizenship, French citizenship, or English citizenship, or Spanish or Italian citizenship, but for instance, if they are condemned, I think it could be considered that they are imprisoned, for instance, for a crime or a delict. It could be considered that they would not accomplish what they have been sentenced to if they relinquish their citizenship. Citizenship could also be bought and also be exchanged for life pension. Of course, it wouldn't be an enormous life pension, but it could be like the smallest in France, there is something called
minimum wage.
Minimum wage. They could be rented minimum wage, which in most cases, in their own country, would give them a very comfortable way of life, level of comfort. So all sorts of possibilities can be discussed and considered, I think. But mostly they would themselves designate themselves for having vocation to return to their own country, either by their behavior or by their discourse.
Thank you. We still have time for one final question from the audience, if there is a question.
Well, it would be interesting to hear whether Mr. Camus considers if the emergence of a common European identity is a prerequisite for the reversal of the great replacement.
Thank you. A very interesting question, Mr. Camus. Do you consider the emergence of a common European identity as a prerequisite for reversing the great replacement?
Unfortunately, no, I do not consider it as a prerequisite because it would be a very difficult prerequisite to obtain, to realize. I feel myself very European. I love Europe, European culture, European poetry, European literature, European music. I love all countries in Europe, and I feel very European. I'm not at all anti-European. I'm not even sovereignist. In France, there are people called sovereignists who want France to depart from the European Union, for instance. I don't want to depart from the European Union. I think we should reverse its policy. We should conquer it politically and reverse its policy. Its policy has been absolutely horrible. I think, of course, Brussels is the Vichy of what I call the second occupation. So I think there should be a real new Europe. Vienna, for instance, would be much better capital of Europe as Brussels. It's more central between Latin Europe and German or Nordic or Scandinavian countries. I think it is right in the middle between Catholic Europe and Protestant Europe. I think it's right in the middle between Eastern and Western Europe. And I think it is a very big imperial city which has been deprived of its empire. So I think Vienna would be a natural capital for a new European Europe, if I may call it so. And this Europe, which I desire very much, would be, of course, anti-repressist and would come back to history. I think Europe, after the trauma of the Second World War, decided to withdraw from history, which is one of the main reasons of the present disaster, the change of people and of civilization. I think Europe should come back to history, should be the great world power that it has always been and that it is naturally. I think it should have, for instance, an army. I think it's a horrible shame that the great continent, which has been so glorious, rely for its defense on foreign army and foreign spending. I think it's really very much dishonorable. And I think Europe should be built on culture and civilization. One of the wrong things, it was probably wrong to start by economy and by the common market and market. I think it should be history and culture and civilization, which will be the cement of new Europe. And that Europe, of course, would want remigration, decolonization, or would be the result of remigration and decolonization. It's impossible to say what would be first, but if one or two important countries become anti-repressives, which I, of course, wish very much we could conquer Europe, I think no country in Europe should leave Europe. For instance, I was very sad that Great Britain or England, Scotland, Wales left the European Union because, of course, Europe without England, without the United Kingdom, is not Europe at all. In my mind, it was a contribution of Britain to the European civilization and culture is absolutely major, and Europe, which would not have Britain amongst it, will not be a real Europe at all. So I think Europe should unite and come back to history.
Thank you, Mr. Camus. I still have another question from the audience, which a person whispered it to me when you talked. And the question is as follows. Do you believe that things have to get much worse before they will start to get better? Maybe this is a very Norwegian question, because we are not in the same phase as France is in regards of numbers with immigration. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, it's hard to imagine that they could get much worse than they are. I'm not afraid of disaster. I'm against disaster. And they are horrible. Many countries are turning into very dangerous slums. In France, everything is collapsing. For instance, hospitals are collapsing. Trains are collapsing. School is a total ruin. I don't think it could get much worse. I don't wish that it would get much worse. I wish that people would get more conscious. But I think, I don't know how much time you are giving me, but I think that the horror of the situation is part of make it short, publicity. I think the forced science, which have made more progress since the Second World War, are so-called communication science. We are living a sort of happy disaster. People are not conscious, they are so manipulated by the press, by school, by television, by all those that don't realize what disaster we are in. What I wish is that revolt would have for basic element coming back to consciousness from people, much more than the disaster being worse. I wish that people would realize what disasters they are in. I must say, I very often say that the only thing I have to offer is that I do not understand. One expects of an intellectual, which I am not, I'm a writer, which is a very different thing from an intellectual, but one expects from a writer or an intellectual or whatever that he understands things. And I like to say that the only thing I have to offer is that I do not understand. I do not understand that my people, French people, but maybe it's true also for Norwegian people, for British people, for Swedish people, indeed, or German people, or Belgian people, I do not understand how they can accept what their ancestors have considered as the worst thing which could happen, being submerged by other people, being drawn into other civilization, being conquered, being civilized, being colonized. I do not understand. I do not understand. I like to say that my only contribution is that saying and saying again that I do not understand how my people or other people what can admit the disaster they are living, and the only explanation to that is that they are manipulated by forces of which science or pseudoscience, including sociology, are very responsible. The numbers are very responsible. They have been given numbers and numbers which have been totally lying and are an element of negativism of the reality of the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Camus. We have now spent an hour. You are still able to take some further questions?
Oh yes, it's not. It's not.
Thank you. I have several questions for you, and some of them are very interesting. So I will ask a key question, which perhaps requires a longer answer. But this regards what is the political way forward? How do we make the changes so that the great replacement can be reversed? That's a practical question. Do you have an answer to that?
Yes, political action, revolt, using the model I have mentioned before. Personally, I'm of course deeply non-violent, so I do not, of course, approve of any violence, but we can have a symbolical action which can be very strong. Everything which is not violent has my total approbation. Is an elections, strike, anything, uniting, marching into the streets, everything which show a will of reversing that horrible crime against humanity, which is the great replacement. But I think, of course, the first thing is becoming conscious of the horror of that crime, which are the crime against humanity of the 21st century.
So if I could follow a little bit up on that, if we talk specifically about France, you see the possibility of a parliamentary solution to the Great Replacement taking place?
Well, I hope so, but I must have not much hope. Elections are totally manipulated. People do not, if you consider the election, the situation is even worse than it is really, because people seem to be voting over and over for the people who want their disparition, their eradication as a people. They are still electing constantly, and there have been for 40 years people who want their disparition, their colonization, their eradication, and their death as a people. So it's desperate, and it's very hard to keep faith into elections which are entirely manipulated. By which I don't mean that the elections are manipulated themselves, but people are manipulated. For instance, in thinking, there have been an illusion to that people which are opposing the Great Replacements are fascist or Nazi or neo-Nazi, when they are precisely the contrary of that. As I said before, I think the only real anti-Nazi are anti-replacements, like we are also the only consequent and logical ecologists. The only real ecology is what we stand for, because we are also fighting for biodiversity and human diversity and the peaceful relation between races, all races being kept and protected.
Thank you. There is an online question here which I would like to read. How would you respond to someone who argues that the ethnic composition of society is irrelevant, it is vanity, and that the issues, the real issues that we face today, are different ones?
Well, I would say that those people are in a total illusion. It is a big illusion. It is a very illustration of what I call prison negationism. Ethnic reality are very real. I think individuals can always be integrated into different ethnic composition. In France, they always have very happily, either for them and for friends, individuals from every people, every race, every civilization in the world can indeed become French. But I do not think that people can, people like an ethnic group, like a cultural group, like a civilization can be integrated, can integrate individuals, but not all peoples. And if you consider that ethnic reality has no importance whatsoever, this is exactly, for instance, why I was referring before to Sigmund Bauman and the liquefaction of humanity. Liquid societies where everybody is perfectly exchangeable because he has lost every character. Of course, the fight against races, to make races disappear, is almost entirely won, and it seems that the effort of global racism now is changing to sexes. It seems that our masters do not want sexes. Sex, man, woman, boy, girl, things like that, they are all trying to, this is contrary to the establishment of liquid humanity, what I call MHI in French, la matière humaine indifferentiated human matter, which is a perfect nightmare, but which is what the industries of man want to establish, a totally liquid humanity, which of course is the same all over the world, and the world is of course very much advanced already towards sameness, towards being the same everywhere. Or big city or metropolitans are tending to be the same all over the world. And this is a perfect nightmare. The dignity of man is of being irreplaceable. Replaceable man is what the industries of man want to produce. They don't want races, they don't want sexes, they don't want different culture. What they want is a general mix where ethnicity, among other things, would not be of any importance. Wanting that is being a lie, an accomplice to the crime of destroying the biodiversity and the diversity of the world.
Thank you. There is a follow-up question here regarding France. Do you, when we talked about reversing the Great Replacement, would you say which political parties in France or which political groups would you say come closest to promising to fulfill your ideas? Are there any?
Well, I must say I was standing by or for the party called La Reconquête, which is the party of Eric Zemmour, which has been a failure. It's not been a success in any case, but the party still exists. But it is obvious that it won't be enough, sufficient to reverse the course of evil. But if you ask me whom I see feeling closer to, it is, yes, that party, which after all had 7% of the vote in the last presidential election, which is not nothing.
Thank you. There is also another question here regarding racism. It says, our society seems obsessed with racism. How does this obsession relate to the Great Replacement?
Well, it does very much. I think what made Great Replacement possible is a proclamation, say, in the mid-70s, of what I call the dogma of the inexistence of races under the pretensions of science. Real point, the forces, industrial forces, mechanical forces, who want to make man to be an undifferentiated human matter, have had science proclaim that there were no races. To proclaim that thing, the paradox is that you had to take a conception of race which had been the one of the worst of races before, that is a scientific or biological conception of race, which were the conception of the worst of races, notably of the Nazis. But if you consider that scientifically races do not exist, you have to take for conception of race the one of the worst races. I think that races are, of course, many other things than that, but this is a very small and for me not very important part of what races are. Races is the word which was very deeply established in all languages, in all poetry, in all literature of the world, and it certainly has not a poor little scientific and biological meaning. It means, among other things, inscription of time. One of the effort of democracy now, of global replacism, is to impose a sort of permanent presence, where the reference to time, to the inscription in history, in the long duration, would disappear, which it does. When you say that people do not know history, for instance, doesn't only mean that they do not know that what history was made of, what was the events of the past century. What's not knowing history means now is not realizing there are past. People, young people at least, do not seem conscious that there have been centuries. They don't even understand often the word centuries. You speak of the 17th century, that doesn't mean anything to them. So one of the elements of the liquefaction of humanity, as Sigmund Bauman describes it, is the imposition of a permanent presence. This is very much what I think. I don't know. This question was so rich and important that maybe I forgot the question, but I also think that it is anti-racist, which are totally, and the word anti-racism has totally changed meaning. Of course, anti-racism was perfectly legitimate after the horror of the Second World War, about the death camps, about the eradication of the Jews and of other people like the Syrians. Anti-racism. You could not be not anti-racist. But anti-racists are totally changed meaning. Now anti-racist is proclaiming that there are no racists, so it is anti-racism which are becoming globally genocidal. They don't want races in an absurd, they're totally illogical, because they pretend that there are no races, but all races are equal. You can't stand those two things. So anti-racism having totally changed meaning, I think it would be very fortunate and wise if the word racist could also totally reverse meaning. But I admit that it is a difficult wish to see realized, but racist should mean what the word, the syntax of racism implies much more than what it means generally today. Racism would mean the conviction that races exist, the conviction also as very important in the destiny of humanity, of people, of countries, of continents, and the wish of the happy coexistence of as many races as possible in the world. But I do admit that this total reversal of the meaning is probably pure wishful thinking, and it's very difficult to realize, to obtain.
Thank you. We are now approaching the end, so I will ask you just an open question regarding the fact that your book is being published in Norwegian. I don't know if you are familiar enough with Norwegian country and politics to say something about your book in relation to that. Have you followed the debates in the Norwegian press regarding the publication of your book?
No, I've not followed the debates in Norwegian press because I have to admit that I don't understand Norwegian, but I'm well aware of Norway. Often been to Norway as a country I know. I think it is the most beautiful country in the world. I don't say that because I speak Norwegian. We thought, in my mind, we've only possible rival Scotland, which I also think is very beautiful. But I'm well aware of Norway as a country. I like its history, I like its music, I like, of course, its writers, and I even have written a book about Norway, because I do a collection of books about the houses, what I call demeure. What is the word for demeure in English? Places of the mind, which are about the houses of writers, composers, painters, and one of the books is about, I must say, not only Norway, but Denmark of Norway, and Norway, Denmark and Norway, a demeure d'esprit about Norwegian writers, painters, artists, thinkers in Norway. So I've traveled rather extensively in Norway with others. Non, c'est celui de la Suède, mon cher. C'est évidemment comme Norvège. I have traveled very much.
Non, c'est ce qu'il n'y a pas un moment donné de Suède.
Oui. Ok, mais pardon, mais c'était bon. Oui, non, oui, c'est bien. Oui. Voilà le livre. It's a rather fat book, but
yes.
It's a book about Norway with the Crackrow Mountain, which I think is the most beautiful mountain in the world.
That I did not know. Thank you, Mr. Camus. That is very interesting. I think that we are going to finish now, and I would like to thank you for the conversation and for the most interesting book that you have written. And as I said before, I hope it gets a very wide readership in Norway. I think the ideas are very good subject matter for discussion. Very good subject matter for discussion. I also think that the publisher would have a few words before we close. Is that correct? Yeah. And again, Mr. Camus, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for hosting or doing this interview with Camus. And thanks, Wu, for taking the time. It's been a long day and a few long weeks here in Norway with a massive media attention around your book. And now we are looking forward to kickstarting it all over again in a few weeks when we will have a Norwegian talk in a public library about your book, since the book is in Norwegian. And I hope to see you soon. And
you too.
Yes, I wish you a good evening and a big round of applause for Renaud Camus. That concludes our evening. Let's get a photo here. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
Får vi opp noe på bakgrunnen der, Rikard? Får du opp noe på bakgrunnen? Takk for oppmøtet. Ja. Veldig hyggelig. Takk for at det er utrolig at så mange kom, og så morsomt at det var så lite media. Da vet vi, da har de på en måte kastet masken helt. Nå vet vi at de bare vil snakke om Camus, men ikke med han.